Welcome, everybody. We're so pleased that you joined us for our first Climate and Society event of the spring semester. My name is Pamela Smith. I'm the director of the Center for Science and Society. The aim of the Climate and Society series is to consider climate from all the many disciplinary and practical perspectives that such a complex phenomenon needs. For those of you joining us for the first time, the stimulus for this series was Columbia University's historic founding of the Columbia Climate School last year. This new school serves as a hub for interdisciplinary research, education, and practice focused on climate and its related challenges. The climate crisis is so multidimensional and so urgent that it demands more than just a scientific or technological lens. Instead, as we all know, it calls out for the combined expertise of researchers in social and human behavior, culture, politics and policy, economics, communications, and many other areas. Over the last 2 semesters of the Climate and Society events, we've heard from many distinguished speakers from outside Columbia. But in the coming semester, we will be mainly focusing on conversations among Columbia researchers. So we're absolutely thrilled to launch these Columbia conversations in Climate and Society today with 4 Columbia interlocutors. I'm going to introduce them momentarily. They're going to discuss co-production of knowledge and a path for inclusive climate change science. Their conversation today also marks the launch of a new phase of their co-production project, following up on the release of their documentary, Ice Edge. It's a wonderful film, which they'll talk about a little later. I founded the center in 2014 to bring together researchers, scholars, and practitioners in the natural and social sciences, humanities, law, medicine, and the arts to engage in interdisciplinary research, teaching, and outreach. The center works to eliminate traditional disciplinary silos, create new hubs of interdisciplinary teaching and research, and enhance public understanding of science and society. If you're interested in this event or in learning more about us, please sign up on our website. There's a link there to sign up for the newsletter and announcements. So please join us at other events. As you can see from this slide, we have many Climate and Society events this spring, showcasing the work of leading scholars and Columbia researchers on climate, environment, sustainability, and their social and cultural dimensions. We hope you can join us for these. I want to thank our partners for this series, including the Climate School, Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, the Climate and Society MA program, and the Columbia University Dean of Humanities, Sarah Cole. They've all been instrumental in planning the series and conceptualizing it. And I also want to thank heartily the behind the scenes co-production of this event, in particular, Joseph Sulik and Darwin Ng. So you may have gotten to this point in the event tonight, and you're still wondering, what is the co-production of knowledge? Maybe you Googled it. If so, you'll find that a simple Google search reveals a wealth of co-production of knowledge as a concept and a method in many fields: healthcare, environmental science, business research, poverty research. Well, the actual on-the-ground co-production of scientific knowledge has happened really since the beginning of modern science. Robert Boyle engaged in it with his laboratory technicians. Charles Darwin relied on the knowledge of pigeon breeders, for example, in formulating his theory of evolution. James Joule pulled in the embodied expertise and the concepts of beer brewers, Manchester beer brewers. His father was one, he learned the trade, in formulating thermodynamic theory. In my own work in the history of science, I look at how the work of 15th and 16th century craftspeople and the knowledge that they possessed and expressed in their artworks and in their texts and their books co-produced new methods of engaging with nature and new views of the relationship of humans to nature that were important results of that period of the so-called scientific revolution. So I've always been deeply interested in the co-production of knowledge in the investigation of nature. And the concept of co-production is something that goes back to the 1980s and has been of interest to science studies scholars, especially those working on social construction of science. And just to give you one example, in Science, Technology, and Democracy, Daniel Kleinman gave several examples of the ways that scientific knowledge has been co-produced. One of them was the quite well-known case of ACT UP, AIDS activists advocating for and finally being placed on NIH citizen panels to help direct funding for AIDS research and to open up clinical trials. And another example he gives are science shops that were set up in the Netherlands in the 1980s. They sought community input in order to direct science policy and research to local concerns. It was a kind of science policy from the bottom up. More recently, citizen science has become a well-known aspect not only of science outreach, but of the production of scientific knowledge itself. Particularly in the environmental sciences, co-production is becoming better known. And you can see those two graphics at the bottom come from Nature and Science, the journals Nature and Science, respectively. So all of this is to say that I was absolutely thrilled when I came to know about the work of our speakers today and their plan to embed the principles of co-production firmly at the center of research at Columbia's new climate school. So we come to the main event tonight. Our speakers today are Alex Whiting. I'm just going to stop my share here. So I want to introduce our speakers as Joseph spotlights them. And I'm going to start with Alex Whiting, who directs the Native Village of Kotzebue's environmental program, which he developed in 1997. The program focuses on researching the physical environment and ecology of Kotzebue Sound and integrating Indigenous knowledge into scientific research projects. Most recently, the program helped lead the Ice Bridges project that researched ice and ringed seal denning habitat of northern Kotzebue Sound. Ajit Subramaniam is a microbial oceanographer at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and studies the base of the marine food web and how this is affected by climate change. Christopher Zappa is a research professor at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. He is an observational physical oceanographer with a focus on atmosphere, ice, ocean interaction. He has extensive expertise in autonomous surface vehicles and aircraft, as well as instrument development. He was the lead PI on the Ice Bridges project that has successfully built bridges between a diverse team of scientists, the Native Village of Kotzebue, and Indigenous knowledge holders to produce new knowledge about the changing sea ice environment of the Kotzebue Sound, Alaska, and its implications for sustained subsistence existence. Carson Witte is a fourth-year PhD student at Columbia University studying air-sea interaction under the mentorship of Professor Zappa. His experience thus far in the world of community-oriented science has been as a researcher on the Ice Bridges project in Kotzebue, Alaska, and as a community science fellow for the American Geophysical Union's Thriving Earth Exchange, where he is working on flooding and related health issues in marginalized communities in South Carolina. I just want to say that if you want to participate in today's event, we hope to have plenty of time for audience questions and comments. You can raise your virtual hands during the Q&A session at the end of the event. We're going to start the evening with a clip of this new documentary that you can also watch on YouTube. It's the link will be shared in the chat. So without further ado, I welcome you all to start, and Joseph to start the clip from the documentary. Thank you.
Normally, in March and April, this is frozen solid all the way to the outside lead, another 20 mile out here. It's not supposed to be like this up here 30 miles north of the Arctic Circle. You got to recognize this as a threat to life on this planet.
The ice out here stops growing in the middle of winter.
This is going to be the fourth year where we have no ice in the ocean. That's unheard of. And there are times when I went out here to hunt, I'd go 65 miles out, straight out in the ocean and hunt. Now I can go a mile and a half. 4 miles.
There's been abrupt and unexpected and unprecedented changes in the sea ice.
This past several years, we couldn't go out there because we didn't had stable landfast ice soon enough throughout the winter. The ice that we're standing on just kind of formed here January. It should have been frozen in October.
Literally, life is at stake that I feel it's my responsibility to try and help with.
Hi, my name is Sarah Iñupiaq Betcher. I'm the documentary filmmaker for the Ikaaġvik Sikukun project. This project was based out of the remote rural community of Kotzebue, Alaska, between the Bering and Chukchi Seas, with research being conducted in Kotzebue Sound. I'd like to share with you how our collaborative project was led by an Indigenous Advisory Council in cooperation with scientists to understand how sea ice, the ocean, and marine mammals are changing in Kotzebue Sound.
Okay, that gives you a sense of what's going to be discussed this evening. And I'm going to ask the first question of Alex Whiting. Alex, can you tell us more about your experience and your views of co-production of knowledge, please?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about our project. So from our perspective, Native Village of Kotzebue, I've been here for 25 years carrying out research projects. And the Native Village of Kotzebue has easy access to, daily access to Indigenous knowledge and knowledge of the state of the environment. And we have our own set of needs and priorities when it comes to the environment, the change in the environment, and also research. And so our approach has been to marry our Indigenous knowledge and skill sets with the knowledge and skill sets that we don't possess and that academia possesses or government agencies possess, with laboratory techniques and specific tools and different kinds of knowledge, veterinary medicine, for example, or in the case of the ice edges, oceanography knowledge, and bring those two together to produce results that are that match more closely reality and that are holistic, I guess, in the sense that they're able to access basically all the knowledge that is available for a certain set of circumstances. So it really is just, for us, it's just combining, again, the Indigenous knowledge and skill sets with the Western science knowledge and skill sets in order to accomplish our research objectives, which is the further understanding of the state of the environment.
I understand that you have a particular project that you're working on besides the the bridges project.
Well, one of the projects that, I mean, we have a number of projects, but one of the major efforts that we're undertaking is to advance our knowledge of cyanobacteria in Kotzebue Sound and understanding the drivers of that. It's a relatively, in our experience, a relatively new and emerging phenomenon. And it has implications for the future of the environment and the current state of the environment. And that's where I'm partnering with Ajit to develop a research program where we can more fully understand what's going on in that part of our environment.
Hey, Alex, this is Ajit here.
Do you want to say something about your seal tagging project?
Also, back in 2003, the Fish and Wildlife Service developed a tribal wildlife grant, and one of the priorities for the Native Village of Kotzebue at that time was to understand bearded seals, which we rely on as part of our cultural mainstay. It's a major resource of the Native Village of Kotzebue and our members, bearded seal hunting and the meat and oil in particular that we get from the bearded seal. But once the bearded seals leave the shore zone areas, the areas close to communities, there wasn't a lot of available knowledge on where they went and their behavior out away from the shore zones. And so around that same time, satellite tagging technology, the ability to fix transmitters onto animals and record their movements and other behaviors using satellite technology was just coming to the fore. And the scientists to that day, both the Department of Fish and Game in Alaska and also the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who's responsible for marine mammal management, had been unable to live capture bearded seals. And so I developed a proposal with a retired biologist from ADF&G to use the knowledge of our local citizens here, the knowledge of seal behavior, to develop a method of capturing them alive and handling them and affixing satellite transmitters and releasing them unharmed back into the environment. We were successful at that, and we were the first ones to actually capture bearded seals and tag them. And we continued along bearded seal tagging program for about the next 10 years, along with ring seal tagging program in the same approach. So that was one example where without co-production, the ability to move forward the science of seal behavior was inaccessible, even to agencies as well-funded and experienced as NOAA and NIMS. And in fact, when NOAA and ADF&G, well, NOAA in particular, went through other areas to try to replicate that activity, it took them quite a few years before they were even successful, because the Native Village of Kotzebue, not only did we have a good geography, but we also had people that were used to working on those kind of research projects and able to do it effectively and expeditiously. So that was one example of many where the Native Village of Kotzebue has, in that case, led the nation and actually the world in that case in research like with the bearded seals.
It's fascinating. Do we want to look at other examples of co-production projects? Chris Zappa, do you want to say something about your project?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for this discussion. I think it's really a great opportunity. I also want to thank our advisory council of elders, and without their participation, this really couldn't have been, project wouldn't have gone anywhere really. And with Alex's work in really the impetus for the project of getting us both together, both the elders and our groups at the University of Alaska and at Columbia University. So about 5 years ago, I'll just say a little bit about our project, what we did. About 5 years ago, the Iñupiaq Elders of Kotzebue, the Native Village of Kotzebue, together with scientists from Columbia University and the University of Alaska co-developed questions to answer changes going on in Kotzebue Sound and how the community's future might be affected by climate. So this project, Ikaaġvik Sikukun, which is the Iñupiaq phrase for ice bridge, melded Indigenous observations, monitoring from aerial drones, in situ geophysical measurements within the ice and the water, and ocean and marine mammal science to address questions, forge this unique dialogue. So the Ikaaġvik Sikukun project has successfully built bridges between this diverse team of Indigenous knowledge holders and scientists to produce new knowledge about the changing sea ice environment in Kotzebue Sound itself and its implications for sustained subsistence existence for the community. I think one really important aspect to this was that we broke new ground by co-developing our hypotheses in partnership with the Indigenous Elder Advisory Council from the very beginning and defining the research questions that cut across disciplinary boundaries, incorporating Indigenous knowledge and utilizing technology enabled methods that address the needs of both the local and scientific communities. And then to share this, as you've noticed, or you've shown already, to share this knowledge more broadly in a way that respects the oral traditions of Indigenous knowledge. Our team worked with a filmmaker, Sarah Betcher at Farthest North Films, who documented each step of our research journey along the way. Over the past 5 years, we've designed and carried out a research plan to observe the sea ice and the marine mammals in the Sound and how these came together as habitat and hunting grounds. And our methods included Indigenous knowledge about seal behavior, hunting practices, together with cutting edge technologies such as remote sensing from UAVs or drones and satellites, as well as more classical oceanography, such as moorings, that looked at changes in the ocean over the course of the year. But throughout this process, and this is, I just want to really drive this home, is that we engaged a continual dialogue with the Advisory Council from the beginning through to co-interpreting the findings and developing new questions.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, Ajit.
Yeah, so I guess I'll jump in here first to say thanks to Pamela and the Center for Science and Society for giving us this opportunity. I think the question you asked, Pamela, is really key in that, in the introduction you mentioned, one of the key take-home messages for me is that there isn't one way of defining co-production. And what we're hoping here is that by illustrating different projects that we've been involved in and how they evolved, how they came about and how they evolved over time, it comes clear to the audience here that there are many ways in which these can happen, and they all hopefully are going to be successful or have been successful, but they all end up in success, even though they might have had different origins. From my own example, Alex mentioned it in the beginning. I was in Kotzebue as a part of the Ice Bridges project, but I was talking to Alex, and my own background is in phytoplankton and microbial oceanography, and we were chatting about stuff. And he mentioned to me about this problem of cyanobacteria, which basically had me clicking immediately about how that is in so far north and how common is it, so on and so forth. And over a period of time, through a lot of discussions with Alex, we have essentially come up with a plan where we want to test to see if this is a consequence of climate change, that there was no incidence of cyanobacteria that we know of that have been passed down in oral traditions prior to the late aughts, that is prior to about 2008 or so. And since then, we've been seeing blooms of this organism basically grow every year. And Alex was concerned, and now I'm speaking for Alex, so Alex, just jump in whenever, right? Alex was concerned that this is something that would have an impact on the community. This is something that we need to worry about just in case it is potentially toxic. This is something that we need to worry about because it might change the food web, the base of the food chain, because we are now replacing the phytoplankton that would normally be growing there by cyanobacteria. And so he was very much interested in trying to figure out how to understand this phenomenon and what the implications might be. And he has been working with a few different scientists since 2009 in establishing the fact that it actually contains toxins and that it might be affecting other organisms. Actually, as a consequence of our discussions and a little bit of initial funding, we actually got some instruments in the water late this summer. And subsequent to that, there was a massive fish kill of herring. And we're still in the process of trying to figure out what killed the fish and if it is common or if it is something that happened only this year. But for me, this is a good example of how this constant communication and the back and forth in terms of, and I must confess, I proposed some dumb ideas out there that Alex was quick to shoot down saying, oh, it doesn't work that way. And then there have been other ideas that have taken root and we've moved forward with. But for me, this is a really important part. I might be putting, so for me, Alex is a valuable, he's a collaborator, he's a co-investigator with me. So there is no us, they, us, them sort of a sense in how we are discussing our ideas and moving the science forward. This is something that I think is really important to get across because there's also a certain level of trust that needs to be developed with the people you're engaging with in order to be able to get there. So for me, this is another example of a project that sort of evolved from questions being asked and a series of conversations. And now we are actually getting to where Alex wanted to go, which is impact on the community and deeper science questions as to how is climate change affecting the base of the food web? Is it going to cause problems? And how might it impact the sustainable existence in the far north? But I suspect Carson has an entirely different angle on the co-production through his experience with the Thriving Earth Exchange.
Yeah, thanks, Ajit, and thanks everyone for having me. So my main tie to this conversation is that I was part of the Ice Bridges project with everyone else you see on your screen. But I'm also a community science fellow for AGU's Thriving Earth Exchange. And that is it's a type of community-oriented science that I think some people would not call co-production, but I think it's I wanted to share it here because I think it's a valuable sort of perspective on how different these kinds of projects can look and can still be focused on the goals and needs of the community and can be based on the experiences and understanding of the community. So my Thriving Earth Exchange project and Thriving Earth Exchange projects in general, the structure is that you start with 6 months to a year of just the community science fellow, who is the person who works for Thriving Earth Exchange. Everything's pro bono, but we just work with the community that has applied to Thriving Earth Exchange with an issue that they could use scientific help on. That's kind of the broad prompt for how a community would apply to Thriving Earth Exchange. And you just work together. So I worked with the leaders of this community that keep getting flooded in South Carolina, and they're being flooded in at times when there isn't a big rainstorm and they don't know where it's coming from, right? So that's kind of where we started. But then it takes a year of dialogue to understand all of the context, all of the factors that sort of go into that one sentence summary of what's going on, and really trying to get to a point where I, as essentially a mediator, understand where the community is coming from, what they need, and really what the issue is, and also what kind of help a scientific approach could provide, and what kind of scientists I should be looking for to recruit to be a part of the project. So that has a lot of similarities with the Ice Bridges project in Kotzebue, where the first year of that project was dedicated to building trust and having open dialogue with the Elder Advisory Council. But in that case, the Elder Advisory Council were holders of traditional knowledge that really had a huge impact on the formulation of the questions. And in this case, in South Carolina, these community leaders were not necessarily coming saying, we understand the system well and we want to partner. They were saying, we want help. And so then the challenges are a little bit different. And one of the key things you have to keep in mind there is that they still do possess an enormous amount of important knowledge and information. And that's kind of part of the challenge of bringing that out. So we'll continue to talk, I think, mostly about the projects in Kotzebue, but I'll try and touch on this other project occasionally just as a kind of contrast to show kind of different ways that community-oriented science can occur. So does anyone want to speak further on the sort of introduction to our co-production projects?
I think that maybe the one question that might be worth exploring further, Carson, might be exactly how the questions were formulated, because I think that in the 3 examples that we have provided, 4 examples that we have provided, the questions came about slightly differently. And so, you know, I'm curious to hear from Alex how how did the seal tagging project actually start? I mean, who asked whom what, and how did that sort of how did you figure out what were the tools needed and go about doing what you did?
So the Native Village of Kotzebue has been involved with marine mammal co-management organizations in Alaska. They're Alaska Native organizations that actually have congressional authorization to enter into formal co-management agreements with the federal government. And the Native Village of Kotzebue was instrumental in developing the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee back in the 80s. And then by the late 1990s, early aughts, it was obvious that a similar ice seal committee needed to be formed, and the Native Village of Kotzebue was instrumental in seeing that begin and formulating that. And Kathy Frost, the retired biologist from the ADF&G, the Marine Mammal Program, was both part of the entire beginnings of the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee, but also was there during the development of the Ice Seal Committee. And so because we had that relationship with Kathy from those co-management organizations, she knew of the Native Village of Kotzebue Environmental Program, and she knew of my interest to carry out co-production and community-based research. And she realized that there was a potential opportunity to develop a community-based program for capturing bearded seals and affixing them with these relatively new satellite tag technology. And so once the Tribal Wildlife Grant Program, which is a funding opportunity because of course all research takes funding, and it was a brand new program that the Fish and Wildlife Service had created, and it was only for the only eligible applicants were federally recognized tribal governments, which Native Village of Kotzebue is. And so it was obvious to her that it would be a perfect opportunity to use that forum to apply for, develop a project and apply for that funding. And that's what we did. And then we continued to get funding through the Fish and Wildlife Service, but we also got funding from some of the oil companies that were interested in offshore oil development and knew that they needed that kind of information in order to develop mitigation plans and to apply for permits and whatnot. And we received additional funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation also. And then the state of Alaska, as we continued and we had success, the state of Alaska developed their own community-based seal tagging program based off of what we created. And they continue to do those kind of activities now, here almost 20 years later, 2000, now almost 20 years later. Holy smokes, time goes by quick. But yeah, so yeah, I kind of forget what your question was now, but that was the story of the seal tagging operation.
Fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, do you want to say anything at all about how this came about for ice bridges? I mean, the question
Sure,
is
no.
both, how the questions came about and what constrained the questions. It's like you can do almost anything you want, right? But then you sort of focused on some particular aspects.
Just since this is a conversation, were we going to throw that clip up there, or are we not there yet?
Sure, no, we can throw the clip up.
Also hope that people can follow the path that we've tried to create to demonstrate how scientists can work with Indigenous communities, not just to answer questions, but even to be discovering what questions they should be asking to start with. The definition of hypotheses is fundamental to the scientific method. And to date, the Indigenous voice has been missing from that part of the scientific method.
Pretty much every time we try to acknowledge our traditional knowledge, what they claim is invalid, basically because there's no documentation of what we know.
It took me a while to realize that this is what I'd been looking for. I've been working with Indigenous experts for a long time and often found it difficult to know how to really work their knowledge into my framework of understanding. And the answer seems obvious once you know it, but I think you've got to do it from the beginning. You can't plug it in halfway through or tack it onto the end. It sort of has to be in there from conception.
Like this project, I can see it's going to be real beneficial, basically, to the future, in the future, because we're validating what our people knew.
It's a really good hook. This is the design that old Eskimos had.
Usually forums like that just about every year from what I remember after it freezes over.
You mentioned trust. That was a key component right from the beginning. I mean, building a level of trust is always very important, but it allowed us to go into the community from the beginning without a blank slate, in as much as we had tools or observational tools and that put restrictions on what we wanted to do, but within the guidelines or the construct of those tools, we came up with questions driven by the Elders Advisory Council that basically set what was important to the community and what was driving the research questions from the beginning. And over the course of a year, we developed those questions over conversations with our advisory council. What else? Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I have a question sort of for Alex moving forward on that same vein. So my Thriving Earth Exchange project has been my first experience of being the bridge, or what people sometimes call the boundary spanner, in a project like this, which is a very crucial piece of any project of this nature, is somebody who can speak the languages of everyone involved and can begin to tie together what may have started as disparate scientific and community groups. So Alex, you've had more experience than most being that person in the middle of everything. And I'm just wondering, from your experiences, what has made projects most effective? What advice would you give to anyone thinking about wanting to do a project like this, who has something in mind but isn't quite sure how to create those connections? What have you seen in your experience?
Yeah, so that is challenging because in order to develop a relationship or a partnership, you sort of need two or more willing participants. And there's still a lot of tribal communities, including basically all the tribal communities around Kotzebue here in the region, and even in the Bering Straits region, where there's another couple dozen communities down there or so, that are, most of them that are still unfamiliar with approaching these kind of relationships. So I guess one of the challenges is that academia or government researchers need to truly understand the value that research can get. I mean, the value in the sense of not what can Indigenous knowledge, in my case, Indigenous knowledge, I know there's, you know, the local knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, but in our case, Indigenous knowledge, well, not what that can do for the researchers, but that there's a lot of potential value in that knowledge to advance understanding forward and to seek out knowledge for that reason, which is important, as opposed to, you know, a more selfish region to try to advance somebody's what they already consider their focus and priorities, is to have a way to interact with the communities in a meaningful manner, but also in order to develop that relationship. So I guess my point going back was that it is still difficult when communities themselves haven't developed their own capacity in order to interact with researchers and to coordinate involvement, meaningful involvement of local citizens and local like their own tribal governments with researchers. And so while I guess the best that Native Village of Kotzebue can do, and what we've been doing, is of course share our experiences and some of our tools, like our research protocol that we developed years ago, back in around 99 actually, which outlines research priorities of the tribe, but also has a questionnaire that answers the sort of who, what, when, where, and why for researchers, in order to understand from the very beginning what researchers, what they're bringing to the table, what their interests are, and as a way to begin a conversation about what researchers have the ability to do, what kind of knowledge they possess, but also what the tribe's priorities and interests are in the general area of what the research is already interested in. And so it's very helpful to have a organizing process, a formal process like that for communities, especially tribal communities, to interact with researchers. And so I guess getting back to my point is that what the Native Village of Kotzebue has been doing is just illustrating how effective, that effective relationship building process and accountability process looks like, and the kind of results that can be outcomes of that sort of serious, formal, well thought out, considerate process and stuff. And so that's what we do, is we sort of lead by example, at least with other tribal communities and with researchers that work in Alaska with other tribal communities.
So I guess if I were to pick up from that, I will ask this question of both Carson and Alex a little bit, which is how do you, you're representing, in Alex's case, an entity, a local entity, and in Carson's case, you're representing community, an organization perhaps. How do you make sure that they're, what's their role, or how do you sort of interact with them?
I'll go ahead and take that first, I guess. So in my case, it's certainly less formalized on the community side, in the sense it's basically a neighborhood, and the community leaders are the ones who are sort of, through a natural process, have become de facto spokespeople for this particular issue. And so there is definitely a potential pitfall that you may not actually be representing the views of the entire community, as a unified block. And you don't, I personally, as an outsider to these communities, don't necessarily have the ability to know when that's the case. And so it's just a matter of just being aware that that's a possibility, and continually talking with the community leaders about getting input from the rest of the community. And how can we, a big conversation that we've had ongoing in that project is just how can we literally put people's experience into the final product? And that way we can, hear from more people than just the community leaders, even though they are the ones doing the work and sort of representing that perspective. I'll let Alex go.
Yeah, Alex, and for you specifically, the question, I guess, is how does the tribal council fit into this, and what's the relationship that you have with them that sort of enables some of these things to happen successfully?
Well, the tribal council is sort of all important in the sense that they're the ones that set the policy for the Native Village of Kotzebue. Now, who I work for, the administration, they set policy for the administration. And so in order for myself to participate in research projects like Ikaaġvik Sikukun, once the sort of draft details, the skeleton as it were, are worked out, then, and it looks like something that I believe, or the administration thinks, is a good project to participate in and a value added to the tribal community, then I bring that to the tribal council through a resolution in order for them to sign off or not, give approval or not on our participation in any particular research project, especially if it involves any kind of resources, funding resources and whatnot. So, and then once the tribal council approves that process, if they do, then it's basically our marching orders to carry out that project. So at that point, it becomes the directive of the Native Village of Kotzebue to fulfill the proposed project. So that's how the council is. They're the ones that actually direct us to do this or that kind of project.
Thanks. Sort of to pivot from there, to ask a slightly perhaps rhetorical question, because this is a question I think that is important to us as academics, and maybe there are members of the audience that might actually have points of view that we would be anxious to hear about. But as academics, we need to get our research funded. We need to convince our peers that our research is worthy, that research that includes or that is built around the notion of co-production is worthy of being funded, and that there are actual benefits to doing this ethically, and that the science is better for it. And so sort of a general question out there, how do we go about demonstrating this? Would we have been able to do what we did, for example, with ice bridges? Or how would ice bridges have been, would have looked different if we did not go through the lens of co-production? I mean, I can speak very specifically to the cyanobacteria project, which is that it potentially would not have happened if Alex and I had not had a discussion about it. The problem is essentially convincing my peers that it is worthy of funding with the constraints that we have. That the actual project that we end up doing is richer for the fact that it is located in Kotzebue and is done with members of the community there, led by Alex, doing the research, and that we learn more from sampling every 10 days over the whole ice-free season than a single cruise that happens 100 miles offshore once a year to describe how the Arctic is changing. So in some fashion along those lines.
Is that a question? Are you asking a question?
No,
well, the question is what are the challenges in obtaining funding? Sorry, Pamela, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask you, Ajit, how would your project have looked different? I mean, and maybe it wouldn't have happened, you said, because it came out of a conversation, kind of a shared object of interest and expertise. But, you know, if you had then gone off and done your project in a different way, you know, as a kind of in what we think of as a conventional way, what might it have looked like? How would it have been different? You know, or rather, how is the co-production different than that?
For me, the importance of co-production is in the nature of the question asked, right? I mean, the question I would have asked would be very different. And when I say I would have asked, people are asking these, I mean, this is not happening in vacuum. People are doing work in the Arctic all the time. And yet no one has come to Kotzebue to study cyanobacterial blooms yet, or no one has done it yet, I guess, with that specific point of view. And so for me, that is essentially the way the co-production happened. But it is still very much of a struggle to basically convince my peers that good science will come of this. To me, there seems to be still some skepticism amongst my peers in terms of how what you think of as solid science, whatever that might mean, might happen. So it's essentially just trying to get around that. But perhaps we can move right along to the next.
Yeah, we want to leave some time for
yes.
discussion. We already have questions. Yeah.
So one of the things important to this topic, co-production, is sharing knowledge with the community after we, you know, what are the modes of communicating our blends of findings, and how does your new knowledge maybe impact people's daily lives? And I'll put that on Ajit right off the bat.
Yeah, so, you know, I think that Icebridges actually showed some interesting ways in doing it. We've talked about the documentary that was produced, but we also produced this newsletter, a series of newsletters actually. You can find them on the Icebridges website to download for those who want to see it in more detail. But the point of these newsletters was to really communicate who these strangers in the community were, what we were doing, and what we were finding. So these newsletters essentially had brief snippets about what we were measuring and what we found. And these were distributed. So as you can see in this, in the screen that I'm sharing, one of the example newsletters where we talk about these things. These were distributed as newsletters and put in everyone's mailbox. So all the people who lived in Kotzebue got a hard copy that they could read at their leisure that translated some of our questions and some of our initial findings in a language that was understood. And perhaps Alex wants to take on, you know, the thing of which was the most popular. But really, we can communicate these at several levels. That is, you know, Alex as a co-PI, we basically constantly talk back and forth. And then we talk about the findings with our elders and get their help in interpreting what we are finding. And then finally put out our findings to the community at large. But Alex, you want to talk about the ice-mice balance measurements and how they found use in the community?
Yeah, I can share that. I could also one of the ways that I guess I'll share both of these now. So here's some examples of various projects, all different projects here. One of them being the Ikaaġvik Sikukun project. These are all co-production. Everything we do here basically is co-production projects. That's the only kind of research I've done since I've been here. well, for the most part, we have done some where we interviewed our citizens about, the fish and wildlife resources they harvest. Even that, though, to a certain extent, was co-production because we brought in biometricians to do the statistics and whatnot, because it had to be a statistically done survey. But my point being is that one way of communicating co-production to the community is through the involvement of the community, because these citizens here that you see, they're all community members. And so not only do they learn themselves, learn from the scientists themselves, different information, but other people in the community that they live with or related to or friends with or whatnot will ask about what they're up to. And so they can communicate and share information that way also. And then like in the example of the Ikaaġvik Sikukun, one of the things we did was we measured snow and ice depth throughout the course of most of the winter, or at least the spring anyways. And so around here, because we use, because snow and ice isn't, recreational in the sense of like in the lower 48 where people might ice fish or ski or skate on the ice. And, when it's close to, when the ice gets sketchy, they just quit doing those activities because they're optional and mostly recreational. But up here, the snow and ice is used as travel corridors to not only just go out for day trips, but also to travel to other communities and to travel to outlying camps. And it's a daily part of activity up here is going out on the ice and snow. And so as we get closer to breakup time, people become more and more interested in the travel conditions because they want to continue to travel out on the ice and snow as long as possible and as long as it's safe. Although they're willing to push the safety envelope to a certain extent, like people down south wouldn't be, because they have more reasons to do so. And so as the season progresses and the ice gets closer and closer, like in this bottom left-hand channel site picture, which is right in front of Kotzebue, and so it's the main place that everyone that wants to leave Kotzebue, at least to the north and east, has to go out on. As it approaches zero, people become more and more interested in that. And so when we started posting these on our Facebook site, and the majority of people up here use Facebook. Facebook is now the new and most popular method of communication up here, even before the pandemic, but even especially after the pandemic. And so when we started posting these on Facebook up here, we would get, 4 or 5, even 6,000 views, even in one day on our information. And so that was the best example that I've ever seen since I've been here of measured interest by the community, and not only in Kotzebue, but the outlying villages also that travel back and forth to Kotzebue. And scientific research results. So that's the reason we're using this example, is because it is actually the best example of people not only interested in it, but actually requesting us to post this information and refresh the information. And so, it's the number one success story when it comes to the community crying out for the results of our scientific investigation. That's all. Oh, stop share screen. Thank you.
So I was going to share screen and show, we have a playlist of YouTube videos. I'm actually just going to paste the link in the chat because my computer is being weird about sharing screen. We're tight on time, but we didn't only have a documentary filmmaker making a long form documentary, which just recently came out and you should totally watch if you're interested. She also is making video shorts on a much quicker time scale. that were released over the course of the later few years. Oh, looks like perfect. Chris was able to pull it up. And so these are like 5 to 20-minute videos about specific pieces of the project that we were sharing on platforms like Facebook, like Alex said, to try and let people who are interested in the project but maybe aren't going to sit down for a feature-length film, learn more about a specific piece of it that they're interested in, whether it was because they saw UAVs flying overhead, or people who are not in Kotzebue and are just intrigued by the project and want to learn about a specific aspect of it. So that was another way to make that documentary filmmaking work more accessible by breaking it into bite-sized chunks to begin with. And the last thing actually I would say about knowledge exchange that has been alluded to a little bit is how much of it occurs just in like colloquial conversation outside of the maybe specific times and places and events that you've set up to have those exchanges. Those are super important, but also you are also just building relationships. So a lot of the knowledge exchange that I had with one of our elders, Bobby, was sitting over coffee in his house, waiting for the day to get started for, we were waiting for another collaborator to arrive or whatever. So not underestimating the value of that and just acknowledging that that's a big part of knowledge exchange as well is a great thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about how that's going to happen.
Can I ask a quick question beyond dissemination? What about crediting? How does that happen in publication of the results?
That's a great question, Pamela. It actually feeds right into what I was going to chime in on next. So we've had 3 publications in peer-reviewed journals, and on each of them, our Indigenous, the Elders Advisory Council were co-authors, and prominently co-authors, especially on the paper that Alex and Donna Hauser wrote on, essentially looking at over the past 17 years, looking at the seal hunt season, how it's shrunk about a day per year or more per year, and that the seal habitat itself was shrinking as the sea ice declines. Looking at both journal records and satellite data. And I just wanted to touch on how dissemination regarding that, beyond just the papers and acknowledging our elders council, we also disseminated kind of as part of the newsletters that Ajit was talking about. I'm just going to leave it like this. We distilled down the essence of those journal papers that maybe everyone on Facebook wouldn't be reading into kind of nice distillations of the results of the co-production that was in those papers. So here we talk about what the successful seal hunts were in the past versus how they may look now. Oops, why I did that, I don't know. Anyway, I'll stop share. We can move on to our next question, which I think was,
I
Alex
guess.
Go ahead. Alex was going to ask something, or what's our next?
We'll sort of, I'm watching the clock here, Chris,
yeah,
and
yep.
Sort of we need to give time for questions. So maybe we just wrap up now with some final thoughts on what you think would take us forward in terms of inclusive climate science. And I'm throwing this out to everybody. Maybe Chris, you want to go first?
You want me to go? Sure. So first thing I'd say is that the project, and this goes to your question earlier, Ajit, is that the project itself wouldn't have been possible without co-production knowledge approach, because the research design happened with the advisory council, from the design to the measurements, to the interpretation, to the results, to the documentary that we just released. All of it was a continuing process of co-production. And also, I'll just say a little more. Beyond that, the publications, as I mentioned, where the advisory council were co-authors, and it's a direct reflection of the evolution of the process, where year after year we're carrying out co-design research. The elders were asking us to address this unprecedented diminished sea ice that we were witnessing when we were there. And as Alex showed in those sea ice time series plots, we were seeing that we weren't capturing, in modeling that sea ice decay, we were missing a heat source. And so, and we had later learned from the elders that the ways of life in Kotzebue to understand that the importance of the river channels for food security and on-ice safety, and the persistence of the Iñupiaq, that the river itself was very important in Iñupiaq cultural values. So we were able to put together additional measurement program because of this ongoing discussion with the elders, discussing the results and then making new measurements based on our discussions. So it's this continuing process. And I think that's kind of a key point to take away, is that you need to continually engage from the beginning and throughout the process, where everyone's a valuable participant.
And that's covered so nicely in the film as well. Carson, Alex, Ajit, do you want to add anything to that?
I can add something. I would say just in terms of thoughts on how to do this type of science, how to take this type of approach. Part of it is recognizing that not all situations will be appropriate for specifically a knowledge co-production approach. And that doesn't mean that you should just do like parachute science instead, where parachute science meaning you just drop in and take data and then leave and never talk to the people who actually live there. There are many different ways that you can do it. And the important thing is that you are trying to listen from the beginning to what people there already understand. And if you're already in a project, you can also still try and incorporate this into that project. So even though this co-production of knowledge project that was from its inception built on the incredibly valuable knowledge of a council of elders, like that might not be exactly what's available to you, but that doesn't mean that no sort of community-oriented science is available to you, and that you should look for lots of examples of it being done well, but also look at examples of it being done poorly, because that is often where you can learn the most.
And it's interesting to think about the funding structures that need to be set up really to enable that kind of long-term iterative conversation and back and forth. So it really demands a new model of funding and thinking about the way that science can be carried out. Alex, Ajit, you want to say anything more before we open it up? We're getting closer and closer to the end here, so I'm trying to push you along a little.
Alex?
Oh no, I mean, I like Carson's points. They were good points. So I appreciate that. Thank you. I mean, to Carson, that was good.
Carson put it really well. So for me, the only additional thing I would say is, as students, as teachers, as peers who are reviewing proposals, manuscripts, sitting on PNC, think about this as a lens through which you're seeing the world and using it appropriately. And again, as Carson put it, it may not always be appropriate, but think about it is basically, I guess, my closing take-home message.
Yeah. Okay, thank you all. We're going to open up the conversation at last to the audience. We already have questions in the hand raises, so I'm just going to call on people in the order they've raised their hand. Valerie Lechner, or Leshane, I'm sorry.
Hi, thanks so much for a really exciting presentation. So my question is in response to Ajit's question about funding. And I think I want to ask, how does the science develop impact the large scale application of this knowledge? And more specifically, I think it involves understanding or responding to the question, how can scientists develop a further understanding of the applications of their findings. And then it brings me to ask about ESG. So how might including the owners of capital as co-producers in this process help? And I'm thinking about, then how can we involve these people with clear rules that kind of limit the reproduction of capital, and in finding these opportunities that often greenwash and prevent meaningful climate action. Like that would be, I'm thinking about all of these large, like these millions of dollars that have signed on to ESG goals without there being a substantial system of verification for where these financial flows are going. And in involving scientists with this process, especially in connection with Indigenous communities and communities on the front line of both climate and capitalism, since the two are synonymous, could be a way to not only bring funding to this process of co-producing knowledge, but also verify this amount of capital that has moved towards climate response through the ESG framework. So it's a question to a question, so I don't necessarily expect a clear answer, but I wanted to raise these points within this community.
Thank you very much. Do any of you want to take that?
Well, perhaps the only thing I'll say is that to reiterate the point that when scientists undertake these research, that they seriously consider how the effects of co-production will impact the impact of the science that they're co-producing, and the impact of the research they're doing, and whether co-production is a mode through which the impact is transmitted to the community.
This is not an answer to your question. You just said something I really liked that I wanted to repeat, which was co-production as a potential way for scientists to learn more about the impact of their research. I think it's something you see often in academia, where an academic has really impactful research and can't even fully articulate its global impact or its larger scale societal impact. That's another potential benefit there of I've certainly learned a lot more about the impacts of what we did was a geophysical study, seen through one lens, but the paper we wrote was not exclusively a geophysics paper. And I learned an enormous amount more about why we do this kind of research by doing it through this lens. Anyways, not the answer to your main question. I just really appreciated the way you phrased that.
Thank you. That's great. I'll call on Thomas Brewer. If you could just unmute.
Thank you. Thanks for your work and your presentations. I'm interested in your interactions with other scientific communities. In particular, have you had any experience participating in the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in the past? And even more importantly, do you have plans to participate in the next round, AR7, which is about to begin? I think your work is obviously important, and I'm sure that the IPCC people, if I may describe them as that, I'm sure that they could benefit a great deal from your work, but I'm a little worried about whether they're going to be very receptive.
Why are you worried about whether they're going to be receptive? Because they are unfamiliar with co-production?
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, we're starting somewhere. Please, Alex, go ahead. Yeah, Alex.
Well, I mean, sort of along those same lines. In 2005, we did contribute and participate in the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, which was the first multidisciplinary comprehensive report to Congress on climate, and one of the chapters in there was Indigenous perspectives. And because of the different research that we did at that time, we were invited to participate in that. And so anyways, from the Native Village of Kotzebue, that was one area where we did get our voice out there to policymakers and stuff. And so whether opportunities like that with the IPCC or others, presents itself again, one of the ways in order for us to take advantage of any opportunities like that, or what is to get our message to policymakers, is to continue to do the kind of research we do, so we're in a position to participate when those opportunities do arise and stuff. And so I would say that.
Thank you. I hope you will be persistent.
Yeah, we're persistent. One thing about people living in the Arctic is you have to be persistent. The environment is trying to beat you down all the time. In order to survive up here, it takes persistence, that's for sure. So we're all well versed in that up here.
Good.
So thanks.
Thank you.
Does anybody else want to speak to that? IPCC grant rounds.
I guess, Chris? No? Okay. I think that one aspect in what we're doing here is that we are providing, hopefully we're providing a platform, megaphone of sorts, I guess, of the issues. And while we may ourselves not directly be involved in the IPCC reports, publishing them in peer-reviewed journals is one way of getting a lot of this information and knowledge out into the realm that the people who are actually writing the IPCC reports will have access to the scientific findings. So will hopefully act as amplifiers in some fashion.
Excellent.
And I guess along those same lines, I guess since we have a few minutes, is that, so the reason that the Native Village of Kotzebue participates in research is not academic. It's because we not only are we interested in learning more about what's happening in our local environment beyond that which we can ascertain ourselves through our own knowledge and tools that we have available to us here locally, but the reason that we do all this is in order for us to advocate for the Arctic and advocate for those resources. And so in some ways, whether it's, like directly to your question about being involved or contributing to the IPCC, all of that information, like the IPCC, like the ACIA, those are, so there's an academic side of that, but really the whole point in some ways of that. So the useful point of that beyond the academic is in order to inform policy, in order to move policymakers. And so in that sense, that really is what drives at least our participation in these, is because what we want to do is to share information, accurate information, in hopes that policymakers are able to become motivated to act on that. And even if it's not in the larger global context of like taking action as a national government on climate stuff, it also is in the smaller ways of like informing when they were offshore leasing in the Chukchi Sea, being able to inform those projects during the NEPA process and permit process in order to mitigate harm to those resources that we depend on, using information that we were able to publish to inform those mitigation and permit requirements to protect the resources that we depend on. So that really is what lies at the root of why we do what we do, is in order to affect outcomes. So that I guess that's related to your question in that way.
Could I ask a question? I think it's mainly to Alex, but to all of you, and that is that in my own work on historical figures, there's very little left of, say, the indigenous knowledge of, wise women who are collecting herbs and supplying physicians and, supplying natural historians in the 16th and 17th centuries. So there's no real record. I mean, there's no evidence. And what is happening with this kind of project is you're not only, making new knowledge, new scientific knowledge, but you're also, providing a voice and providing a way that other ways of knowing can be valued, recorded, and really enter the historical record and the scientific record. Now, there's new knowledge being made. I'm not saying that that's the only value. So I just wonder, Alex, whether you have that sense that that's happening.
Well, yeah, definitely, and that's the other. So besides advocating for resources, the other impetus that drives us is to have our people's voice recognized, and that's been one of the frustrations with sort of the colonial approach, the extractive approach to research in the Arctic, is that people here felt like their recognition was being ignored, their voice was being ignored, their concerns were not being heard, and so that goes part and parcel to the reason that we do this. Is it gives us a forum, a platform, in order to make sure that our voice is heard, and our what people want to say is put out there in the record. The knowledge that they want to share with the rest of the world is put out there and recorded.
Thank you. I see one more hand. Shall we go to that, or unless any of you? Okay, Rara Murray. You're going to have to unmute. You're still muted, I'm sorry to say. See if I can help you with that.
Thank you. Yeah, it wasn't allowing me to unmute.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pamela and Alex. Unfortunately, I arrived late. I want to honor all of your ancestors, my ancestors, and the ancestors of the lands that we're currently standing for this webinar. And my question is to Alex, to follow on what Pamela said. Alex, do you know if there are other indigenous peoples from other parts of the Arctic around the world that are using a similar system to infuse science with indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, so especially in Canada for sure, but even in Greenland too. I mean, Greenland in some ways even more than Canada, because Greenland is used to driving their own policy there, because indigenous people are just like Nunavut in Canada, though both of those places, they have a lot of autonomy, so they drive the system. Russia to a lesser extent, but even in Russia. And I think the International Circumpolar Conference, or the ICCC anyways, they've been pushing these issues too. And so they bring together all the circumpolar regions and promote and discuss issues like the one we're talking about today.
That's fantastic. I was wondering if we don't have much time, I wanted to talk to you about a similar concept that I'm thinking about to do across, areas that have rainforests, arid lands, to have similar collaboration. May I check in with you later via email?
Yes, please. Yes, please do.
Okay, Matt, would you be able to put the email in the chat or private message me?
Sure. Yeah, we'll do that. Joseph, if you could take care of that, thank you. Well, we are at time. I just want to say that this has been absolutely wonderful. It's been really, I think this is an eye-opening project. I'm very excited about it. And, it's not just, as Alex just pointed out, one project, but it's a whole movement in the way that science is done now. And I think it's extremely promising for, what we're going to learn and how we're going to make science more open, inclusive, and give intellectual credit where credit is due. So it's just been great to have you all. I really urge the audience to watch the documentary Ice Edge. It's a wonderful documentary. It will really give you a good idea of some of the ideas and the methods that have been discussed here today. Anybody want to have a final word before we close? Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you to the audience for
Yeah.
these great questions. And please join us on March 7th for our next Climate and Society event. Thank you all so much and have a good evening.